They called my nail salon cheap, then asked if the owner could lower the rent, and I remember holding her hand, steady and careful, as I painted the second coat of pale pink across her nails, like nothing she said had touched me at all. I told her I would check with the owner, and she laughed softly, the kind of laugh people use when they think they understand everything about you, and I just nodded, because I had learned a long time ago that silence could carry more weight than words ever could. The salon smelled like acetone and lavender oil, the hum of drying fans filling the space while a daytime talk show played quietly on the TV mounted in the corner, and outside, the Texas sun was already warming the strip mall parking lot by 10 a.m., the kind of morning I had lived through thousands of times. Women came in talking about school pickups, grocery prices, husbands who worked too much, and I listened the way I always did, quietly, attentively, like part of the furniture they barely noticed. But this group was different, for women, late 40s, maybe early 50s, dressed in clean lines and neutral tones that said money without trying too hard. The kind of people who spoke about square footage and investment returns while sipping iced coffee from glass bottles instead of plastic cups. One of them, the one whose nails I was finishing, leaned back in her chair and glanced around the room again, her eyes pausing on the worn leather of the massage chairs, the small chips in the corner of the front desk, the handwritten appointment board behind the counter. She tilted her head slightly, like she was assessing something she might buy and improve, and then she said it again, a little louder this time. "This place feels cheap, like it drags down the whole building." I didn't stop working, I didn't even look up, I just dipped my brush again and kept going, smooth strokes, even pressure, because perfection in small things was something no one could take from me. They kept talking about opening a luxury beauty lounge, about bringing in a different kind of clientele, about how the upstairs units would be perfect if the building had better tenants. One of them said, "I bet the owner would jump at the chance to upgrade the place. Probably just another small-time renter trying to get by." I smiled to myself, not because it was funny, but because I had heard versions of that sentence for more than 20 years. I came to this country when I was 19, with 2 suitcases and a phone number written on a piece of paper, and for a long time, that was exactly who I was, someone trying to get by, working double shifts, learning words one customer at a time, saving every dollar like it was something fragile that might disappear if I wasn't careful. I had scrubbed floors in restaurants after midnight, folded laundry until my fingers cracked in the winter, and sat in classrooms at the community college repeating the same English phrases until they felt like they belonged in my mouth. So when they looked around my salon and saw something cheap, I understood what they meant, because I had built everything they were looking at piece by piece, without ever stopping long enough to make it look impressive. The woman pulled her hand back to inspect her nails, turning it under the light, and she nodded, satisfied, then reached for her purse as if the conversation we just had didn't include me at all. Before she stood up, she said, casually, almost kindly, "If you talk to the owner, tell them we're interested in the space upstairs, depending on the rent, of course." I nodded again, the same calm expression on my face, and said, "I will let them know." And for a moment, just a brief quiet moment, I watched them walk toward the door, confident, certain, already imagining how they would change this place. They didn't know they were already standing inside something I owned, something I had paid for with years no one ever saw, and I didn't feel the need to correct them, not yet. After they left, the salon grew quiet again, the kind of quiet that settles slowly, like dust in the late afternoon light, and I stood there for a moment with the small receipt still in my hand, listening to the soft hum of the nail dryers and the distant sound of traffic outside, and it reminded me of so many other afternoons just like this one, where nothing looked important on the surface, but everything that mattered was happening underneath. I walked back to my station and began cleaning my tools, wiping each one carefully with practiced motions, the same routine I had followed for years, because routines were what kept me grounded when everything else in life had once felt uncertain. My employee, Hannah, glanced at me from across the room, her eyes asking a question she did not say out loud, and I just gave her a small smile, the kind that told her everything was fine even when it was not something you could explain in a single sentence. The truth was, I had heard those words before, not exactly the same, but close enough that they all blurred together over time. Cheap, small, temporary, like I was always one step away from losing everything I had built. When I first started working in a salon, I rented a single chair in the back of a crowded shop, paying weekly in cash, never knowing if I would make enough to cover the next payment, and I remember standing for 10 hours a day, breathing in chemicals that made my head spin, smiling at customers who sometimes spoke about me like I was invisible, like I was part of the chair or the table instead of a person listening to every word. Back then I told myself it was temporary, that one day I would have something of my own, something stable, something no one could take away from me with a single decision. It took years before that feeling began to change, years of saving every tip, skipping small comforts, saying no to things other people considered normal, and even then, when the opportunity came, it did not look like success at all. The building had been on the market for months, maybe longer, sitting empty in parts, the paint fading, the roof needing repairs, and people said the area would never grow, that it was not worth the risk, that I should stay where I was and not reach for something bigger than my situation. But I remember standing in front of it for the first time, looking at the cracked sidewalk and the empty windows upstairs, and feeling something settle inside me, not excitement, not fear. Just a quiet certainty that I understood what this place could become if someone was willing to stay long enough to see it through. I signed the papers with hands that did not shake, even though everything I had saved was going into that one decision, and after that day, nothing about my life changed overnight. There was no moment where things suddenly became easy. I still opened the salon every morning, still worked long hours, still greeted customers with the same calm voice, because owning something does not always look different from building it. That is something people do not understand. They expect success to announce itself, to be loud, to be visible, to change the way you dress or the way you speak, but for me, it stayed quiet, hidden in the background of everyday life. In the rent checks that arrived each month, in the repairs I scheduled without telling anyone, in the decisions I made that no one ever noticed. So when those women sat in my chairs and talked about the building like it belonged to someone else, like it was something they could shape or improve, I did not feel angry. I felt something closer to recognition, because they were seeing exactly what I had once seen. Only from the outside, without understanding what it had taken to hold it all together for so long. I placed the clean tools back into their tray and turned off the light above my station, preparing for the next appointment, because the day was not over and there was still work to be done, the same work that had carried me from one version of my life to the next without ever asking for recognition. The next morning I arrived earlier than usual, the sky still a soft gray as the sun began to rise behind the row of low buildings across the street, and the parking lot was almost empty except for one delivery truck idling near the grocery store at the end of the strip, and I unlocked the salon door the same way I always did, steady and unhurried, like there was nothing different about this day at all. Inside, the air felt cool and still, carrying the faint scent of polish and cleaning solution from the night before, and I turned on the lights one by one, watching the room come back to life slowly, each reflection in the mirror sharpening as the brightness settled in. I brewed a small pot of coffee behind the counter, poured it into the same white mug I had used for years, and stood for a moment looking out through the glass front, thinking about how many mornings had started exactly like this, quiet, predictable, almost invisible to the rest of the world. Around 9 o'clock the first customer arrived, a regular who came every other week, and we talked about her daughter starting college in the fall, about tuition costs and how quickly time seemed to pass, and the conversation moved easily, familiar and comfortable. The kind of connection built over years of small shared moments. By mid-morning the salon was full again, the steady rhythm of voices and machines filling the space, and for a while, everything felt exactly as it always had. Then I noticed them through the window. The same group from the day before, walking across the parking lot with the same confident pace, their sunglasses catching the light, their expressions focused, like they had already decided something before stepping inside. The door opened and the small bell chimed, and this time they did not sit down right away. Instead, they paused near the front desk, looking around with a different kind of attention, more deliberate, more measured. One of them spoke first, her voice calm but carrying a note of purpose. "We would like to speak to whoever manages the building," and I wiped my hands gently on a clean towel before stepping forward, meeting her eyes with the same quiet expression I always wore. I told her the property manager would be available later in the day, and she nodded, as if that confirmed something she had expected. Then she began asking questions about lease terms, about square footage upstairs, about renovation allowances. Her words precise and practiced, like she had done this many times before. The others moved slowly through the salon while she spoke, touching the backs of chairs, glancing at the walls, their eyes taking inventory of things they believed could be improved, and I could feel the shift in the room, not tense, not uncomfortable, just different. Like the air itself was waiting for something to be said. Hannah looked over at me again, more directly this time, but I gave her the same small nod, the same reassurance that there was nothing she needed to worry about. When the woman finished speaking, she smiled politely, the kind of smile that stays on the surface, and said, "We are very interested in the upstairs space. We think it has potential, especially if the current businesses align with the direction we have in mind." I listened carefully, not interrupting, letting her words settle, and then I said, "I understand. I will make sure the owner is aware of your interest." She studied my face for a moment, as if trying to read something beneath the calm, but whatever she was looking for, she did not find it, and she simply nodded again before turning toward the door. As they stepped outside, I watched their reflections fade from the glass, and for a brief moment, the room returned to its usual rhythm, the quiet conversations, the steady work, the small details that no one else ever seemed to notice. But something had shifted, not in the building, not in the business, but in the space between what they believed and what was true, and I knew it was only a matter of time before those two things met face to face. I did not contact the property manager that afternoon, not right away, and that was intentional, because there are moments when acting too quickly reveals more than staying still ever could, and I had learned over the years that patience was not about waiting. It was about timing. The rest of the day moved forward with the same steady rhythm, appointments coming and going, conversations rising and falling like soft waves across the room, and if anyone had walked in without knowing what had happened the day before, they would have seen nothing unusual at all. That was always the way with things that mattered. They rarely looked important from the outside. Around 3 o'clock, when the sunlight shifted and began stretching longer shadows across the floor, the property manager arrived, not because I called him, but because he was already scheduled to check on a maintenance request upstairs. And when he stepped inside the salon, he gave me a small nod, the kind of quiet acknowledgement that did not need explanation. He had worked with me for years, long enough to understand that I did not involve myself in conversations unless there was a reason, and even then, I preferred to let situations unfold naturally. I told him, in a calm voice, that a group had come by asking about the upstairs units, that they seemed interested in leasing, and he listened without interrupting, his expression steady, as if he was already anticipating the direction this would take. He asked a few simple questions, nothing complicated, just enough to understand who they were and what they might be planning, and then he said he would be available if they returned. Later that evening, after the salon had closed and the lights were dimmed, I stayed behind for a little while longer, sitting in one of the chairs near the window, watching the last of the daylight disappear across the parking lot, and I thought about how often people assume ownership is something visible, something that changes the way a person carries themselves, when in reality, it often looks exactly the same as the work that came before it. I thought about the way those women had moved through the space earlier, confident, certain, already imagining changes they would make, and I did not feel offended by it, not in the way someone might expect, because what they saw was not wrong. It was simply incomplete. They saw the surface, the worn edges, the quiet routines, but they did not see the structure holding everything together, the decisions made over years that allowed this place to continue existing without needing to prove anything to anyone. The next morning came with the same steady pace, and just before noon, they returned again, this time with a different energy, more focused, more direct, and the moment they stepped inside, I could sense that something had shifted. that they were ready to move forward with whatever plans they had already begun to form. The one who had spoken the most the day before approached the front desk, her tone polite but firm, and asked if the property manager was available, and I nodded slightly before turning toward the back office, knowing exactly what would happen next. Not because I had arranged it, but because it was the natural result of everything that had been set in motion. As I walked away, I could feel their eyes follow me briefly, still seeing me as part of the background, still unaware of the role I played in the outcome they were about to face, and I did not correct them, because some truths carry more weight when they are discovered, rather than explained. The property manager stepped into the front of the salon with the same calm presence he always carried, dressed in a simple button-down shirt, holding a folder under his arm, and he greeted the women with a polite nod. That did not try to impress or explain anything. The woman who had been leading the conversation straightened slightly, her posture shifting into something more formal, more deliberate, as she introduced herself and began outlining her interest in the upstairs space, speaking about renovation concepts, target clientele, projected revenue, and how she believed the building could be repositioned to attract a higher-end market. He listened carefully, not interrupting, not reacting too quickly, just letting her finish each point the way someone does when they are used to hearing proposals from people who assume they understand the full picture. The others stood nearby, glancing around again, but this time their attention felt more focused, as if they were already imagining their plans becoming real. When she finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that stretches just long enough to make people aware of it, and then he asked a simple question: "What kind of timeline are you considering for the space?" She answered quickly, confidently, explaining that they were ready to move forward within the next 60 days, depending on lease terms and approval from the owner. The word owner lingered in the air for a moment, and I continued organizing a tray behind the counter, my hands steady, my movements quiet, as if the conversation had nothing to do with me at all. He nodded once, then glanced in my direction, not in a way that drew attention, but just enough to acknowledge something unspoken between us, something that had been understood for years without needing to be explained. Then he turned back to them and said, "The owner is already aware of your interest," and I could see the small shift in their expressions, a subtle change, like they were preparing to adjust their tone depending on who they believed they were about to meet. The woman smiled, softer now, more measured, and said that was great, that they would love to schedule a meeting to discuss possibilities directly, and he paused again, just for a moment, before responding in a voice that remained calm and even. "You are already speaking about the space in front of the owner," he said, and the room fell quiet in a way that was different from before, not uncomfortable, not tense, but still, like something had just settled into place. For a second, no one moved, and I finished placing the tools back into their container before turning around slowly, meeting their eyes without changing my expression, without adding anything unnecessary. The woman blinked once, then again, her gaze shifting between me and him as if she was trying to understand what she had just heard, and I simply stood there, the same way I had stood all morning, the same way I had stood for years, not needing to explain or justify anything. One of the others let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, and said, "Wait, you mean," and then stopped before finishing the sentence, because the answer was already clear without needing to be spoken out loud. The leader of the group adjusted her posture again, this time more carefully, her voice quieter when she spoke, and she said, "I see. Well, that changes things, does not it?" I did not respond right away, not because I was searching for words, but because I understood that this moment did not need them, that sometimes the absence of a response carries more meaning than anything you could say. The property manager remained still beside me, letting the silence hold its weight, and for the first time since they had walked into the salon, they were no longer speaking as if I were part of the background. They were listening, waiting, aware that the conversation had shifted into something they had not expected. The silence did not last long, but it changed everything that followed, because once people realize they have misunderstood something important, they begin to speak differently, move differently, even breathe differently. The woman who had been leading the conversation gave a small, controlled smile, the kind people use when they are trying to regain footing on ground that has shifted beneath them, and she said, "Well, that is impressive. We did not realize," and her voice carried a careful politeness now, measured, deliberate, as if every word needed to be placed correctly. I nodded once, not as confirmation, but as acknowledgement, and I stepped slightly closer to the counter, resting my hands lightly against the surface, still calm, still steady, because nothing about who I was had changed, only what they understood about me. She continued speaking, explaining again their interest in the upstairs space, this time choosing her words more carefully, emphasizing partnership, opportunity, long-term value, and I listened the same way I always had, without interrupting, without reacting too quickly, letting the full weight of what she was offering settle before responding. One of the others spoke up, adding that they believed they could bring a higher-end clientele to the building, that their concept would elevate the entire property, and I noticed how she glanced briefly around the salon again. But this time her eyes did not linger in the same way. They moved faster, more respectfully, as if she understood now that every detail she saw was part of a larger decision already made. I let a small pause form before speaking, not to create tension, but because some answers deserve space before they arrive, and then I said, "I appreciate your interest. I always do when people see potential in this place, because it has taken a long time to build something that lasts." My voice remained even, not cold, not warm, just clear, and I could see them listening more closely now, not just hearing the words, but trying to understand what stood behind them. I explained that the upstairs units were already occupied or reserved for tenants who had been part of the building for years, businesses that had grown alongside the space, and that I valued stability more than rapid change, because I had learned what happens when things move too quickly without foundation. The woman nodded slowly, processing what I was saying, and for a moment, there was no immediate response, just the quiet awareness that their expectations were not aligning with reality the way they had assumed. She tried once more, suggesting flexibility, offering to discuss revised terms, longer leases, higher rent, and I listened without interruption, because it was not the numbers that mattered, it was the understanding behind them. I shook my head gently, not dismissively, just firmly, and said, "It is not about the rent, it never has been." That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else I had said, because it did not fit into the structure of the conversation they were used to having, where everything could be negotiated if the price was right. One of them shifted her weight slightly, as if unsure whether to continue, and the leader took a small breath before speaking again, her voice quieter now, almost thoughtful, and she said, "We may have misunderstood the direction of the building." I met her eyes, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, just with clarity, and I said, "It is not the direction that is misunderstood, it is the reason behind it." The property manager remained beside me, silent, allowing the moment to settle fully, and for the first time since they had walked into the salon, the conversation was no longer about changing the space, it was about understanding it. And, more importantly, understanding the person who had shaped it over time without ever needing to announce it. They stood there for another moment, not rushed, not dismissed, just present in a way they had not been before, and then one by one, they nodded, a quiet acceptance passing between them, not of defeat, but of something they had not expected to encounter when they first walked through the door. They did not leave right away, and that was something I noticed, because most people, when they realize they are not getting what they want, tend to move quickly toward the exit, as if distance can soften the feeling of being wrong, but this time, they stayed, not speaking, not pushing further, just standing there with a different kind of awareness settling over them. The leader of the group looked around the salon again, slower now, her eyes no longer searching for flaws, but noticing details she had ignored before, the way each station was arranged, the small framed photos near the register, the consistency of everything that had been maintained over time without needing to appear new or expensive. One of the others walked a few steps toward the window, glancing up at the second floor from inside as if trying to connect the space they had imagined with the reality they were now standing in, and I could see the shift happening, not dramatic, not obvious, but real, like a quiet adjustment inside their understanding. I did not fill the silence, I let it exist, because I knew this part was not about me explaining anything, it was about them recognizing something on their own. After a moment, the leader turned back to me and said, "You have been here a long time, have you not?" And I nodded slightly, answering, "Long enough to see this area change more than once." My voice stayed even, without emphasis, because the words themselves were enough. She asked how long I had owned the building, and I gave her the number of years, not as a statement of achievement, but simply as fact, and I watched how that number settled into the space between us, carrying weight in a way that no explanation could have done. Another woman asked, almost quietly, "Did you always plan for it to become this?" And I paused for a second, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted to say it clearly, without turning it into something larger than it needed to be. I said I planned to keep it, and everything else came from that decision. That seemed to stay with them longer than anything else, because it was not the kind of answer they expected. It did not speak about expansion or strategy. It spoke about patience, about holding something steady long enough for it to grow into its own value. The property manager shifted slightly beside me, not to interrupt, but to signal that the conversation had reached its natural end, and the leader nodded once more, this time with a different expression, not disappointment, not frustration, just acceptance. She thanked me for my time, and there was a sincerity in it that had not been there before, something quieter, more grounded, and I returned the nod without adding anything more. One by one, they began moving toward the door, their pace slower than when they had first arrived, and as they stepped outside, the sunlight caught them again, the same way it had earlier, but now it seemed to reveal something different, not about them, but about the moment itself. I watched through the glass as they paused briefly near their cars, speaking to each other in lower voices, their gestures smaller, more contained, as if they were still processing what had just happened. Inside the salon, the familiar rhythm resumed almost immediately, a customer asking about a color change, another laughing softly at something on her phone, the steady hum of machines filling the air again. Hannah walked over to me after a few minutes, her expression curious, but respectful, and she asked quietly, "You knew this would happen, did not you?" And I looked at her for a moment before answering, "I knew they would understand eventually." She nodded, not fully understanding, but accepting the answer, and returned to her station, while I moved back to mine, picking up the next set of tools, continuing the same work that had always been there, unchanged, consistent, carrying forward without needing recognition. Because in the end, nothing about the building had changed that day, nothing about the business had shifted, only the way it had been seen, and sometimes, that is the only thing that ever needs to change. The days after that passed the same way most days always had, steady, consistent, without anything that needed to be announced or explained, and if someone new walked into the salon, they would have seen nothing unusual, just a small business running quietly in the middle of an ordinary strip mall. The kind of place people often overlook without thinking twice. But for me, there was a subtle shift, not in what I did, but in how I noticed things, the small details that had always been there, but now felt more defined, like the way sunlight moved across the floor at different hours, or how certain customers chose the same chair every time without realizing it. A few mornings later, I arrived early again, unlocking the door before the rest of the plaza had fully come to life, and as I stepped inside, I paused for a moment longer than usual, looking around the space not as a routine, but as recognition. The quiet kind that comes from understanding something fully without needing to say it out loud. The chairs, the counters, the walls, none of them were perfect, none of them were designed to impress anyone walking in for the first time, but they had been part of something consistent, something steady, something that had lasted through years when nothing else felt certain. Around mid-morning, one of the upstairs tenants came down, a woman who ran a small wellness studio, and she greeted me the way she always did, warm, familiar, without pretense, and we spoke briefly about her schedule, about a class she was adding next month, about how the neighborhood had been slowly changing again, not dramatically, but enough to notice if you had been paying attention for as long as we had. She mentioned that someone had asked about the space next to hers, that there had been interest recently, and I nodded, not surprised, because growth tends to attract attention, especially when it happens quietly over time. She asked if I was planning to make any changes to the building, and I thought about the question for a moment before answering, not because it was complicated, but because the answer had always been simple. I said, I am planning to keep it the way it works. She smiled at that, understanding more than the words themselves, and returned upstairs, leaving the same calm energy behind her that had become part of the building over the years. Later that afternoon, Hannah brought me a small envelope that had been left at the front desk, and when I opened it, I found a handwritten note inside, short, carefully written, from the woman who had been leading the group, thanking me for my time and for the conversation, saying that she had gained a different perspective and that she respected the decisions I had made for the space. There was no request in the note, no attempt to reopen the discussion, just acknowledgement, and I read it once before placing it in the drawer behind the counter, not as something to revisit, but as something that had already served its purpose. I did not feel any sense of victory reading it, because there had never been anything to win, only something to understand, and that had already happened. The rest of the day continued as usual, customers coming in, conversations flowing, the steady rhythm of work carrying everything forward the way it always had, and as I moved from one appointment to the next, I realized that nothing about what I had built required approval, not from those women, not from anyone passing through, because its value had never been based on how it was seen, but on how it had been held together over time. And that was something no one could change, no matter how they chose to describe it when they first walked through the door. Time moved forward the way it always does, quietly, without asking permission, carrying everything with it whether we notice or not, and the salon continued its rhythm, steady, familiar, unchanged on the surface, but grounded in something deeper that did not shift with passing opinions or brief encounters. A few weeks later, I stood outside just before closing the evening. Air warm against my skin, watching as the last customers walked across the parking lot, their conversations fading into the distance, and the building stood behind me the same as it always had, simple, unassuming, not designed to impress anyone who was only passing through. The lights from the upstairs windows glowed softly, each one belonging to a space that had grown over time, businesses that had started small and stayed long enough to become part of something stable, something that did not need to prove itself every day. I thought about the note again, the careful handwriting, the quiet respect it carried, and how different that moment had been from the first time those women walked through the door, when everything they saw had been filtered through assumption instead of understanding. That difference stayed with me, not as something personal, but as something familiar, because I had seen it before in many forms, in small conversations, in passing remarks, in the way people sometimes measure value without taking the time to see what holds it together. Inside, Hannah was finishing the last station, wiping down the surface with slow, careful movements, and she glanced toward me before asking if I was ready to close, and I nodded, stepping back inside and turning off the front lights one by one, the room dimming gradually until only the soft glow from the back remained. We locked the door together, the sound of the latch settling into place, and for a moment, we stood there in the quiet, not speaking, just acknowledging the end of another day that looked like all the others, but carried its own meaning beneath it. After she left, I walked through the salon once more, not checking anything, not adjusting anything, just moving through the space the way someone does when they understand every part of it without needing to look closely. I paused near the window, looking out at the reflection of the room behind me, and I thought about how little of this would make sense to someone seeing it for the first time, how easy it would be to miss what was not immediately visible, and how that had never really mattered in the long run. Because everything I had built here had been shaped by time, by decisions made quietly, by staying when leaving would have been easier, and by holding something steady long enough for it to become more than what it looked like at the beginning. I turned off the final light and stepped outside, locking the door behind me, and as I walked toward my car, I did not feel the need to look back, not because it was unimportant, but because I knew exactly what was there, not just the building, not just the business, but the years that had gone into it, the choices that had defined it, and the understanding that had grown from it. People would continue to walk in and form their own opinions. Some would stay, some would leave, and some would never see beyond what was in front of them, and that was something I had accepted long ago. Because value is not something that changes when it is recognized, it is something that exists long before that moment, shaped quietly over time, waiting for those who are willing to see it clearly. And for me, that had always been enough.